Welcome to another video about the Legend of Zelda timeline. It's now my turn to explain why Tears of the Kingdom, the latest game, didn't retcon the previous 19 games, despite an alarming amount of people thinking it retconned all of them, including Breath of the Wild. Some people think the sequel to Breath of the Wild retconned Breath of the Wild. Alright, start the video. First, let's go over spoiler territory. I'd recommend being far enough to have completed these 3 criteria. You've completed the regional phenomena in the Rito area, you've started the quest for the geoglyphs, preferably you've completed 2 or 3 of these, and having explored the Great Plateau and Forgotten Temple. However, I may mention certain things, not necessarily part of the main story, that come later in the game, so it may be a good idea to avoid this video until you're done, or if you don't mind light spoilers. With that, let's begin. Part 1. Breath of the Wild has not been retconned. I've seen a lot of people that have been confused with Tears of the Kingdom's treatment of events and characters seen in Breath of the Wild. One aspect behind this confusion is the fact that Nintendo seemed to pick and choose who remembers Link from the previous game. Most townspeople outside of Lookout Landing don't remember him, aside from major characters like Hearth in Reno Village or Simon in Hateno Village. One thing that's easily solved is one question I've seen. Why does no one mention the Divine Beasts or the Calamity? Well, for one thing, they do. During a side quest in Reno Village, the pointed rock on the top is referred to as Va Meadow's Perch, and talking to Zelda in the prologue literally has her mention the Calamity by name. The biggest thing that differentiates the two games is the sudden disappearance of nearly every ounce of Sheikah technology. This is never explained in-game, but it can be inferred as to what happened to them. In the game we have the new Skyview towers. These are also actually made of Sheikah tech if you look closely. They have the same pedestals. However, if the new towers do the same thing as the old ones, what lore reason would they have for dismantling them? This question kinda applies to why they would dismantle the shrines and the Divine Beasts as well. And my answer is this. Better safe than sorry. The princess appeared to have sealed away Ganon in Breath of the Wild, but on the off chance that he returned, everyone would probably agree that it would be good to make sure he could not use the tech again. However, I doubt every single piece of tech had been dismantled in the time between the games, so instead, I believe that once the upheaval happened, Ganondorf decided that even though this stuff helped him last time, it ended up helping Link more. So he destroyed whatever the Sheikah hadn't revamped yet. This can be seen by the fact that several smaller chasms across the map are in spots where shrines used to be in Breath of the Wild. Also, it's safe to assume that something powerful enough to split the Master Sword in half is powerful enough to make the Divine Beasts just evaporate. Those are the biggest inconsistencies between the two games, so let's dive into the big, complicated stuff. Part 2. Rauru and Ganondorf. If you're not a huge Zelda nerd like I am, you may start losing your mind in this section. Heck, I nearly did well writing the script. This is the part where I try to explain why Tears of the Kingdom doesn't demolish the entire timeline. Again, spoiler warning if you haven't completed the 3 criteria I said earlier, I really mean it. If you've completed the first geoglyph that Impa helps you examine, you will have learned 2 incredibly important plot details. Zelda was transported to the past long before anything mentioned in Breath of the Wild, and that Rauru, who you met on the Sky Island, was the founder and first king of Hyrule. This information immediately perplexed most fans, who thought that the first Link and Zelda were the ones who founded Hyrule based on the ending of Skyward Sword. However, this was never explicitly stated anywhere, not even in the lore book that they released a while back called Hyrule Historia. This was just the common consensus of what happened next. However, Hyrule Historia does have one big issue that doesn't mesh with what Tears of the Kingdom presents. In Ocarina of Time, one of the 6 sages is the Sage of Light, whose name happens to be Rauru. Hyrule Historia states he existed before the Kingdom of Hyrule was even established. Between Skyward Sword and the establishment of the kingdom, an era of chaos swept over the land, which ended in Rauru, the Sage, building the Temple of Time, the surface one, and sealing the Triforce within the Sacred Realm. However, in keeping with the tradition set by Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom practically forgets the Triforce existed in both its past section and present section, and it honestly appears less in Tears of the Kingdom than in Breath of the Wild. And that's not even mentioning the fact that there's another Rauru in Tears of the Kingdom, this time being a member of the Zonai. I can't even go into the origin of the Zonai here because it's just too confusing to deal with in this one video. But I think I have something that explains this. And technically it makes it so I clickbaited you, but not too much, I promise. Bear with me here. My running theory is that Tears of the Kingdom's past takes place at least 200 or so years after Skyward Sword, maybe longer. Also, don't get me wrong, the Triforce still exists in both games, I think. It just doesn't impact the plot or have anything to do with it. Because there's Triforce symbolism throughout both games, in symbolism of power, wisdom, and courage. As for the two Rarus, I think that the Sage Rauru from Ocarina of Time was named after the first king, and that he inherited the king's light power. We also know that Rauru's time had access to the Forgotten Temple that is presumably from Skyward Sword. I think that because of a video by Zeltic I watched. I'm gonna put that in the description of the video. And finally, there's the two Temples of Time. The first was built by King Rauru and was on the Great Plateau. However, it was then raised into the sky at some point. This led to the Sage Rauru, in the future, building the one we all know and love to house the entrance to the Sacred Realm as is presented in Hyrule Historia. However, this would mean that the establishment of Hyrule as a kingdom would come before the era of chaos. Personally, I don't think this is too drastic of a change. Heck, the Hyrule Encyclopedia's timeline moved around a couple games, so moving around two events that aren't even directly seen in the games isn't too much of a timeline break to me. The next big complication is that of Ganondorf. Putting Tears of the Kingdom at both the end and beginning of the timeline means that throughout the entirety of the remaining games in every timeline, the original Ganondorf is sealed beneath Hyrule Castle. I have an explanation for how this works, but I'm going to spend the next little bit in huge spoiler territory. End of game stuff. Seriously, you have been warned. I have a timestamp to skip to, and I won't use any Tears of the Kingdom footage, so you can just scrub right through without worrying about seeing anything. During the scene in which King Rauru seals away Ganondorf, he says that Rauru is, quote, binding his heart and stealing his magic. Personally, to me it seems like Rauru removes the spirit of hatred that all reincarnations of Demise have, and he does this using his power of sealing light. He seals away the hatred like many Links and Zeldas have done in the games, but not the body. Due to this, the Rage of Demise reincarnates once again, while the original Ganondorf is still trapped beneath the castle. Eventually, after many reincarnations, Hyrule Castle is damaged in the calamity from Breath of the Wild, and the seal on the original Ganondorf is weakened. Zelda seals away the latest incarnation of Demise, and what happens now? Well, why reincarnate again when you can finally return to the original incarnation? There you go. Welcome back for those who skipped ahead, and that's my explanation for Ganondorf's appearances throughout the series. Time to move on to what will probably be the most controversial section of the video. Where in the timeline do these games take place? Part 3. The Timeline. Here is a custom-made, more condensed timeline of the Zelda games. We've already established where the past of Tears of the Kingdom takes place, the years between Skyward Sword and the Minish Cap, so we'll go ahead and label that section accordingly. However, where do Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom's present take place? The answer may be simpler than you think. Now let me ask you a question. Which branch do Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom have most in common with? If you said the child timeline, I don't blame you. I thought that at first too. If you said adult timeline, I don't know, I don't think that's possible. But if you said the Fallen timeline, then we're sharing the same headspace. I know a lot of people don't even like that the Fallen timeline exists, but I'm not here to tear down Nintendo's timeline, I'm here to add to it. In terms of main story implications for which timeline these take place in, there's only really one thing that throws people off, and it's the cutscene where Zelda blesses Link in Breath of the Wild. If you're a fan of Zelda timeline theories, you've probably heard the line, "Whether skyward bound, adrift in time, or steeped in the glowing embers of twilight," dozens of times. This line has often been used to suggest that the timelines have now converged, or that these games take place in the child timeline because it mentions Twilight. But I beg to differ. There's more than a 10,000 year gap between Breath of the Wild and any game that came before it, and I think that the exact details of adventures or legends that came before it have certainly been lost to time. Because of this, Zelda may be referring to a different adventure where Link entered a different world filled with darkness, whose entrance involves a magical mirror. A Link to the Past. I haven't even played A Link to the Past all the way through, so I was quite surprised when I realized that traveling between the Dark World and the Light World involved using an item called the Magic Mirror, which is a pretty cool coincidence and helps line up things for me here. But admittedly, I've given you my weakest point first. The rest of what makes me think they're in the Fallen timeline is the general atmosphere of the games. The tone of Breath of the Wild fits with what created the Fallen timeline in the first place. In both cases, Hyrule lost the battle with Ganon. The state of Hyrule also mirrors that of the Fallen timeline, as any game that takes place in Hyrule in that timeline shows a Hyrule that's been under the boot of Ganon for quite a while before the game starts. In terms of more meta reasonings, there's the fact that Breath of the Wild was originally devised as a way to fully realize the open atmosphere of the first Legend of Zelda game, which takes place in the Fallen timeline. There's also the somewhat confusing matter of the Imprisoning War. While the details of Tears of the Kingdom's war do not match up with the one described in Hyrule Historia, I could see the developers wanting to use a familiar name to entice fans and just drawing the Imprisoning War name out of a hat, so to speak. Finally, the themes of Tears of the Kingdom act as a satisfying flip of the name given to the Fallen timeline. Despite being in a timeline that exists because of defeat, the game shows all of Hyrule joining hands, literally in some cases, and preparing to defeat the ancient evil that has plagued their lives for eons. I think that's a beautiful story to end the Fallen timeline on. However, like all Zelda theories, this is not without its plot holes. I'll offer up my own explanation for a couple of obvious ones here. The first major hole is that if Tears of the Kingdom's past is before most games, how are Zora and Rito coexisting? Wind Waker established that Rito evolved from the Zora, and Breath of the Wild being so far in the future allowed for flexibility in how they coexist there. Personally, I think the Rito from Wind Waker and the Rito from Breath of the Wild's time are different enough to infer that they're completely different species. Wind Waker's Rito are much more humanoid, sporting normal arms and mouths in addition to their beaks and wings. I agree with a theory that I've seen that believes the more bird-like Rito from Breath of the Wild are related to the Loft Wings. The second big plot hole is another light spoiler for some treasure you can find throughout the game, so you've been warned. In Breath of the Wild, its DLC added armor sets that reference older games, and scanning Amiibo would add in armor and weapons from older games as well. These were largely considered non-canon to the game by the Zelda community. However, in Tears of the Kingdom, these can be found in various places throughout the world without the use of Amiibo, thereby making these canon. Here's the plot hole. If Tears of the Kingdom takes place in the Fallen timeline, how are things from other timelines even here? It's not the strongest answer, but I justify it by saying that the gap of time between Breath of the Wild and anything that came before it was so long that similar adventures could have occurred that involved things that look or act similar to objects in other timelines. This doesn't work for every item, some are just too specific to certain characters, but again, it's the best excuse I've got. But with that, we are done with the video. Thank you all very much for watching. I hope I brought a new dish to the table of Zelda theory videos. And also, thank you all very, very much for 700 subscribers. I was at 326 when I released my Mario video, and you've more than doubled my count because of your enjoyment. I hope you enjoyed this video too, and I'll see you next time.